The air hung thick and acrid, a metallic tang of burnt circuitry layered over something cloyingly sweet, like scorched sugar. I stepped out of the unmarked vehicle, the chilly pre-dawn wind doing little to dissipate the oppressive scent. Above me, the monolithic research facility of Thorne Bio-Engineering loomed, a fortress of steel and reinforced glass, now scarred by a single, dark crater in its upper levels. Emergency lights pulsed red and blue across the polished facade, painting the scene in a macabre disco glow. "Reed. Glad you could make it." The lead investigator, a burly man with a perpetually tired gaze, met me at the perimeter tape. He gestured towards the main entrance, where a dozen uniformed officers and several plainclothes colleagues moved with a controlled urgency. "Not much left of the lab, I'm afraid. Looks like Thorne cooked himself." My gaze swept over the security cameras, the access points, the almost absurd level of protection this place boasted. A catastrophic accident in a facility designed to withstand a siege? It already felt wrong. "Any signs of forced entry?" I asked, pulling on my first pair of gloves. The investigator shook his head. "Negative. Every lock, every sensor, intact. Internal explosion. We're thinking either a tragic miscalculation, given the nature of his work, or he decided to take himself out." I followed the investigator through a series of blast doors, each one a testament to the facility's paranoia. The elevator doors hissed open onto a scene of controlled chaos. The entire floor was a ruin. The original lab, I imagined, must have been pristine, clinical. Now, it was a war zone. The heat radiating from the core of the devastation was intense, a ghost of the inferno that had raged hours before. The acrid smell was even stronger here, biting at the back of my throat. I could taste the char. "Over here," the investigator grunted, leading me around a section of what looked like a shattered containment unit. He pointed to a figure slumped against a buckled workbench, partially obscured by a fallen monitor. "That's Aris Thorne." I approached cautiously, my steps crunching on debris. The bioengineer's body was a grotesque tableau. He was slumped forward, his face blackened and distorted by the heat. His lab coat, or what remained of it, was fused to his skin in places, the fabric brittle and charred. The heat had been immense, instantaneous. His posture suggested he'd been caught unawares, perhaps leaning over something when the blast occurred. A single, gloved hand was outstretched, fingers splayed, almost reaching for a small, metallic canister lying a few feet away. "Looks like he was working with something volatile," the investigator offered, his voice low. "The canister is intact, surprisingly. Contents are still unknown, but we're treating it as the epicenter." I knelt, my forensic kit already open beside me. My eyes scanned Thorne's immediate vicinity. The floor was a mosaic of shattered glass, pulverized concrete, and unknown chemical residue. I noted the precise pattern of the scorch marks on the workbench, the way the heat had warped the metal, creating a ripple effect outward from where Thorne lay. It was consistent with a localized, high-energy explosion. Suicide, accident, the evidence seemed to scream it. But then I saw it. It was minuscule, almost imperceptible against the general devastation. On the charred sleeve of Thorne's lab coat, just above his left elbow, there was a faint, almost crystalline residue. It wasn't black, like the soot and ash coating everything else. It was a pale, pearlescent sheen, barely visible under the tactical lights, catching the light at an odd angle. It certainly wasn't from Thorne's clothing, which was a standard white cotton blend. I leaned closer, my breath held. The pearlescent residue didn't look like anything I'd seen from a standard lab explosion. It had a crystalline structure, almost like microscopic salt, but with an iridescent quality. And the blue fiber, it wasn't singed. Not even a little. It lay there, pristine. Almost defiant amidst the destruction. How could something so delicate survive such an inferno, let alone be on the victim's sleeve, if the explosion had originated from within his immediate workspace? My mind immediately flashed back to a case years ago, a labyrinthine investigation into old records stored in the psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records. The details had been buried under decades of dust and bureaucratic neglect, yet a single, meticulously preserved memo, found by sheer stubbornness, had unraveled an entire web of deceit. It had taught me that the smallest, most out-of-place detail, when everyone else was focused on the obvious, was often the key. This blue fiber, this pearlescent dust, they were the equivalent of that single memo. They didn't fit the narrative of a simple, catastrophic lab accident or a desperate suicide. An internal explosion would have incinerated or melted such a delicate fiber. Its presence, untouched, suggested it was deposited after the primary heat event, or perhaps, it was resistant to the heat in a way that defied explanation. I didn't speak, just moved my hand slowly, indicating the exact spot to the photographer, who dutifully began setting up his macro lens. The investigator was already moving on, discussing debris patterns with a colleague. He saw only the devastation, the obvious conclusion. I saw the defiance of a single blue thread, a silent contradiction woven into the fabric of a carefully constructed lie. This wasn't just an accident. This was something far more deliberate, far more intricate. I knelt, my forensic kit already open beside me. My eyes scanned Thorne's immediate vicinity. I noted the precise pattern of the scorch marks on the workbench, the way the heat had warped the metal, creating a distinctive wave pattern that suggested an explosive force directed outward from a central point, not contained within a vessel. My gloved fingers brushed a fine, almost invisible dust from the edge of a splintered console. I collected it, a hunch tightening in my gut. This wasn't just a lab gone wrong. The air still carried the acrid tang of burnt reagents, but underneath, I detected a faint, metallic scent, sharp and unfamiliar. Not part of Thorne's usual inventory, I was sure. I methodically bagged samples, glass shards, twisted wiring, the charred remnants of what might have been a data chip. The security systems, I'd noted on my way in, were compromised, but not entirely disabled. A subtle manipulation, not a brute force breach. Someone knew their way around. Later, in the sterile chill of the forensic examination facility, the medical examiner's voice was a low drone against the hum of ventilation. Cause of death consistent with blunt force trauma and extreme thermal exposure, read. Seems straightforward. Catastrophic explosion, just like the scene suggests. I watched the medical examiner's gloved hands work with practiced precision, the overhead lights glinting off the polished steel of the examination table. Thorne's remains told a grim story of the blast's immediate aftermath. But I wasn't convinced by the straightforward narrative. Anything unexpected? I asked, my gaze fixed on a particular discoloration on Thorne's forearm. The medical examiner paused, adjusting a magnifying lamp. Well, there's this. He pointed with a probe. Embedded in the epidermal layer here, and a few other spots. Microscopic. Almost missed it, to be honest. Looks like some kind of metallic dust. Not what you'd typically find in a bioengineering lab. Too dense, wrong composition for anything Thorne was known to be working with. My breath hitched. Can you analyze it? Get a full spectral breakdown? Already on it. Preliminary shows a high concentration of an unusual alloy. Very specific. Almost. Like something from an old manufacturing process, not modern tech. This was it. My unique, non-lab related trace element. It was a whisper of an anomaly, almost lost in the chaos, but it hummed with significance. Thorne hadn't been alone, or at least, something had been brought to him from an outside source. My suspicions deepened into certainty. This wasn't an accident. My next stop was the precinct interview room, fluorescent lights buzzing. The first person of interest was the rival scientist, Dr. Silas Vance. Vance, sleek and impeccably dressed despite the early hour, exuded a cool professionalism that barely masked a simmering resentment. Thorne was brilliant, yes, Vance admitted, his fingers steepled, but volatile. Unpredictable. His methods were unorthodox. He burned bridges faster than he built them. Our research, while in similar fields, diverged sharply. He thought my approach too cautious, I thought his reckless. Did you ever argue with him? I pressed. Vance's gaze sharpened. Of course. Academics are not nuns, read. We're ambitious. He stole my grant proposal concept once, twisted it just enough to make it his own. Cost me years of funding. I assure you, I had no love lost for Thorne, but murder? That's absurd. I was at a conference, a verified alibi. He provided dates, times, and contacts without being asked. Too rehearsed or just meticulous? My internal clock ticked. Vance had motive, certainly. Thorne's competitive nature had created enemies, and Vance was clearly one of them. Next, the former assistant, Maya. She sat hunched, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Claimed I wasn't dedicated enough, when all I did was try to keep his experiments from going completely off the rails. He took all my contributions, all my intellectual property, and branded it his own. Threatened to blacklist me from the entire research community if I spoke out. Did you ever threaten him? I asked, watching her carefully. She flinched. No. I wanted my name on the work. I deserved credit. I told him I'd expose his unethical practices if he didn't reconsider. But I never would have hurt him. Her alibi was less robust than Vance's. She claimed to have been home, alone. The metallic dust from Thorne's body nagged at me. Vance and Maya both had plausible motives rooted in Thorne's cutthroat approach, but neither seemed to directly connect to an historic alloy. This element felt like a key to a different lock. Back in my small, cluttered office, I reviewed the preliminary reports. The lab's internal log showed a frantic scramble in the final minutes before the blast, Thorne attempting to override a containment breach, or perhaps, trying to prevent an intentional overload. The pattern of the scorch marks, the compromised security, the unique dust. Someone had engineered this explosion, making it look like an accident. I considered the historic nature of the alloy. Where would Thorne encounter such a thing? His research was cutting-edge, not archaeological. I pulled up Thorne's old project files, cross-referencing keywords, looking for anything that might link him to obscure materials or forgotten technologies. The database was vast, overwhelming. Then, a faint, almost invisible entry caught my eye in a subfolder labeled Legacy. It was a cryptic reference to a regional historical society's archived documents, specifically mentioning a defunct industrial site and a peculiar metallurgical process from the early 20th century. The address listed was for an old administrative building, long abandoned, now part of what was locally known as the Psychiatric Hospital Abandoned Wing with Old Records. It was a long shot, a dusty, forgotten corner of the city. But the alloy, the history, the secrecy. I grabbed my coat. The night was young, and the truth, I suspected, was buried deep within the past. The hum of the servers in Thorne's private lab was a low thrum against the silence, a stark contrast to the chaos I'd found here just days ago. Now, the space was sterile, every surface wiped clean of biohazards, but the digital footprint remained. I was deep in it, my fingers flying across a specialized keyboard, navigating layers of encrypted files. The air conditioning unit rattled faintly above, a mechanical sigh-in. The high-security environment. Thorne's work was a labyrinth of advanced genetic sequencing, a field I understood in theory but rarely saw executed with such audacious scope. His research wasn't just about mapping genes, it was about rewriting them, not just for cures but for enhancements, for fundamental alterations. The implications were staggering: global health breakthroughs on one hand, a new generation of bioweaponry on the other. It was the kind of power that could shift geopolitical landscapes, and it made the current scene far more complex than a simple lab accident. My screen glowed with lines of code, data streams, and complex molecular diagrams. I was specifically targeting the project files Thorne had been most secretive about, the ones the lead investigator had dismissed as too complex for immediate review. A genius's ramblings, he'd called them. I called them a motive. Hours bled into one another. My eyes burned, but a familiar thrill, cold and sharp, began to prickle at my scalp. There it was. A ghost in the machine. Someone had accessed Thorne's primary research server, not from the internal network, but from an external, highly sophisticated point of entry, then systematically deleted specific project directories. Not just deleted, but overwritten multiple times, a digital shredding. It was a professional job, a digital ghost. This wasn't Thorne making a mistake, nor was it a simple suicide. This was an orchestrated deletion, a deliberate attempt to erase a specific segment of his work. The timestamps were critical, less than an hour before the explosion. Someone had been very busy, very recently. My jaw tightened. The scale of the attempted wipe indicated not just access, but intimate knowledge of Thorne's most sensitive projects. Only a handful of people would even know what to look for. A shadow fell across my screen. I looked up. Maya, Thorne's assistant, stood in the doorway, her shoulders slumped. She hugged a thin cardigan to her chest, despite the lab's comfortable temperature. "I'm finding evidence of data manipulation," I said, keeping my tone neutral. Sophisticated attempts to erase specific project files, very recently. Her eyes widened slightly, then darted away, fixing on a distant point on the wall. He was always so careful with his data. Obsessed, really? Did he ever mention anyone else having access to these specific projects? Or any concerns about external breaches? She wrung her hands. No. Not explicitly. But he was different these last few weeks. Jittery. He started talking about loose ends. Said he felt like he was being watched, even in here. She gestured vaguely around the high-tech lab. He thought someone was trying to get at his research. Not just steal it, but discredit it. Or him. Discredit him how? I pressed, my gaze unwavering. He wouldn't say. Just vague things about people who wouldn't understand the true implications of his work. People who would twist his legacy. Her voice trembled. He was so paranoid. He even started looking into obscure historical records, things that seemed completely unrelated to genetics. He said he needed to understand the patterns of suppression. Obscure historical records? What kind? She bit her lip, her eyes flickering with a fear that went beyond grief. I don't know. He just had me retrieve some old physical files for him, from an archive. He gave me a location, a specific set of records to look for. It was strange. Not his usual kind of request. Do you remember the location? The data wipe, Thorne's paranoia, the vague historical research, it was starting to coalesce into something far more sinister than a lab accident. Someone wanted to bury his work, and Thorne might have been trying to uncover a historical precedent for such an act, or perhaps even a historical connection to the people now targeting him. She hesitated, then mumbled, it was a psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records. He was looking for patient files, I think. Something about a specific project that was shut down decades ago. He said the suppression tactics used then were a blueprint for what he was facing now. My internal alarm bell screamed. A psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records. This wasn't a corporate rival or an academic dispute. This was something deeper, something with roots that stretched back decades, entwined with the history of scientific ethics and who controlled groundbreaking knowledge. Thorne wasn't just working on the future, he was digging into a buried past, and someone clearly didn't want either to see the light of day. I needed to go there. Immediately. The dusty files from the psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records still gnawed at me. They were a loose thread, a historical anomaly in a case that screamed corporate espionage and cutting-edge science. How did the meticulous Aris Thorne, a man obsessed with the future, connect to such a relic of the past? It didn't fit, not yet, but I trusted the gut feeling that had saved me more times than I could count. The answer, I knew, lay in the present, in the microscopic fragment I now held under the lens. Back in my lab, the sterile quiet was a welcome balm after the oppressive stillness of the abandoned wing. The mass spectrometer hummed, a low, resonant thrum against the controlled environment. I fed the microscopic fragment, the one I'd painstakingly retrieved from the singed edge of Thorne's console, into the chamber. Its journey through the ionization source, the magnetic field, the detector, each step was a calculated reveal, a stripping away of unknowns. The screen flickered, a cascade of peaks and valleys charting atomic weights. I zoomed in, refining the parameters, isolating the anomalous spike. It wasn't a common element. not metal, not organic residue. My fingers danced across the interface, cross-referencing against known spectral libraries. The database churned, processing countless molecular structures, then spat out a match, tentative at first, then definitive. A unique signature. A synthetic polymer. Rare. Specifically, it was a high-density, thermally stable polymer, often engineered for extreme industrial applications, aerospace components, deep-sea exploration gear, advanced electronics casings. Not something you'd find in a typical research lab, especially not as a contaminant from a lab accident. This wasn't a byproduct of Thorne's work, this was an introduction. Someone had brought this material into that lab. My mind immediately jumped to the funding sources. Thorne's research wasn't cheap. He had major backers. OmniCorp. Their R&D division was notorious for pushing boundaries, for dabbling in materials science that bordered on the proprietary, the almost mythical. This polymer, with its specific properties, felt like their fingerprint. It redirected my focus entirely, pulling me away from the academic squabbles and the historical oddity of the old records, at least for now. This was about power, about control over groundbreaking technology. I spent the next few hours cross-referencing OmniCorp's publicly available patents and research papers. It was a tedious dive into a sea of corporate jargon and scientific obfuscation, but I found enough oblique references, enough hints at advanced material development, to solidify my suspicion. This polymer, or something remarkably similar, was in OmniCorp's wheelhouse. Arranging an interview with OmniCorp's liaison wasn't difficult. Too easy, perhaps. They responded with alacrity, almost eagerness. That alone raised a flag. Corporations of this magnitude usually played coy, delaying and deflecting. The OmniCorp liaison, a sharply dressed individual with a practiced smile, met me in a minimalist conference room overlooking the city. Every surface gleamed, reflecting the cold, distant light of the afternoon. Their name was redacted from my notes, only the liaison remained, a faceless corporate entity. They offered me coffee, water, anything I desired, their voice smooth as polished stone. Too smooth. Investigator. Read, the liaison began, gesturing to a seat opposite them at the long, glass table. Thank you for coming. OmniCorp is deeply saddened by Dr. Thorne's tragic demise. He was a brilliant mind, a true visionary. Their smile remained fixed, but the muscles around their eyes seemed to tighten almost imperceptibly. We've identified a unique synthetic polymer, trace amounts, at the incident site. It's highly specialized. Do you recognize this material? I pushed a magnified image of the spectral analysis across the table on a portable screen. The liaison leaned forward, their expression carefully neutral as they studied the data. They didn't touch the screen, didn't even point. OmniCorp is at the forefront of material innovation, investigator, the liaison replied, their voice still perfectly modulated. We develop many proprietary polymers. Without a specific designation, a chemical formula, it's difficult to say. But rest assured, we cooperate fully. Anything you need, we'll provide. Complete transparency. That phrase, complete transparency, always set my teeth on edge. It usually meant the opposite. The polymer exhibits extreme thermal stability and high-density characteristics. It's not a common industrial material. It's designed for very specific, high-stress applications. I watched their hands. They were clasped loosely on the table, not fidgeting, but the knuckles were a shade whiter than the rest of their skin. As I said, investigator, Omnicorp's R&D portfolio is vast. We push the boundaries of material science across numerous sectors. It's entirely plausible that we have developed such a material. However, without more precise identifiers, I cannot confirm or deny its origin. What I can confirm is that Omnicorp had no reason to harm Dr. Thorne. His work was invaluable to us. We were his primary financial backer, investing heavily in his vision. And what was that vision, exactly? I pressed. Beyond the general groundbreaking research that was always mentioned in the press releases? The liaison's smile broadened, becoming almost saccharine. Dr. Thorne was on the cusp of truly revolutionary breakthroughs in cellular regeneration. Imagine, investigator, the implications for human health, for longevity. Omnicorp saw the future in his work. We still do. Cellular regeneration. That was a high-stakes game. A technology that could reshape the world and create unimaginable wealth. It was also a field ripe for ruthless competition. You mentioned you were his primary financial backer, I stated, leaning forward slightly. Were there other entities interested in his work? Other companies, perhaps, that might have seen his progress as a threat or an opportunity to seize? The liaison paused, their gaze drifting to the panoramic view of the city for a moment, as if contemplating the vastness of the corporate landscape. Dr. Thorne was a brilliant man, investigator. Many admired his intellect. But Omnicorp held exclusive rights to his research. Any attempts by competitors to infringe upon those rights would have been met with swift legal action. Their tone was firm now, a hint of steel beneath the velvet. So, you're saying no one else had access to his lab? Dr. Thorne's lab was a high-security facility. Access was strictly controlled, even for Omnicorp personnel. We trusted Dr. Thorne implicitly with the security protocols. The liaison's eyes met mine, unwavering. Omnicorp is a victim here, investigator. We lost a valuable asset and a substantial investment. We want to see justice served as much as you do. The interview ended shortly after, with more assurances of full cooperation and complete transparency. As I walked out of the gleaming Omnicorp tower, the setting sun glinting off its mirrored facade, I knew one thing for certain: the liaison had told me everything and nothing. They had given me a perfectly polished corporate narrative, a story designed to deflect and obscure. The polymer was the key, pulling me deeper into a web of corporate secrets, but the lingering thought of those old records, that psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records, still tugged at the edges of my mind. The killer had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide their tracks, and I was just beginning to unravel how deep those tracks went. The _first_ threat the liaison's empty assurances echoed in my mind as I returned to my lab, the city's hum a dull counterpoint to my thoughts. Their carefully constructed narrative about Thorne's final project, the biopolymer, felt too neat, too perfectly aligned with a tragic accident. I had seen enough accidents to recognize the meticulous hand of design. I spent the next 2 days immersed in the polymer's composition. My personal lab, a sanctuary of controlled chaos, hummed with the quiet efficiency of analytical instruments. I isolated a unique marker, a specific isotopic signature within the polymer's matrix that suggested a non-standard synthesis process. This wasn't off-the-shelf material. This was custom. My cross-referencing against known industrial and academic databases yielded nothing. The polymer, in its precise formulation, appeared to be unique to Thorne's research. Or, perhaps, unique to its clandestine manufacturer. The first incident was subtle. I was driving back from a late-night session, my mind still replaying spectral graphs and molecular structures. A delivery truck, an older model with faded company logos, swerved sharply into my lane on a sparsely populated stretch of road. There was no oncoming traffic, no reason for the maneuver. I reacted instinctively, wrenching the wheel hard, the tires protesting as my sedan scraped against the concrete barrier. The truck, without slowing, continued its trajectory, its rear lights quickly vanishing into the urban sprawl. I pulled over, my hands clenched on the steering wheel, the metallic tang of adrenaline sharp in my mouth. An accident or a warning? The lack of any attempt to stop, to check on me, spoke volumes. I dismissed it, or tried to, as a rogue driver, a momentary lapse in judgment. But the unease settled deep. I found myself checking my mirrors more frequently, my senses heightened. The second incident dispelled any lingering doubt. I returned to my personal lab after a brief trip to a secure archive facility, hoping to find obscure historical data on polymer synthesis that might shed light on Thorne's unique compound. The archive was a relic, a section of an old psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records, its shelves heavy with decaying files and the faint smell of dust and forgotten lives. I'd spent hours sifting through microfiche, the silence broken only by the whirring of the reader. When I pushed open the door to my lab, nothing seemed amiss. The air was still, the equipment dormant. But I felt it, a faint shift in the atmosphere, a disturbance in the precise order I maintained. My gaze swept over the benches. Nothing out of place. No forced entry. Then I noticed it, a microslide, one I'd left positioned under a high-resolution microscope, was now slightly askew. I always aligned it with the stage's grid lines, a habit born of meticulousness. It was off by less than a millimeter. Someone had been here. Someone had touched my work. My hand went to the small, discreet camera I kept hidden. The feed showed nothing conclusive, just a brief flicker, a shadow moving across the lens, a momentary disruption I'd previously attributed to a power surge. But now, coupled with the truck incident, it coalesced into a clear message: I was being watched. My investigation was no longer just about Thorne, it was about me. The next morning, I called Maya. Her voice was thin, hesitant. I could hear the tremor in her words even through the phone. I suggested we meet somewhere neutral, away from Omnicorp, away from the prying eyes I now knew were following me. We met at a quiet cafe on the city's edge, the drone of distant traffic a backdrop to her palpable fear. She gripped her coffee mug, knuckles white. I think you're right, Reed, he started, his eyes darting around the room. About it not being an accident. I tried to tell myself it was, but after what you said, after what happened. She trailed off, swallowing hard. What happened, Maya? I pressed, leaning forward slightly, keeping my voice low and steady. She took a shaky breath. Someone tried to break into my apartment last night. Just a rattling at the lock, but I heard it. I didn't open it. I called the building manager, but by the time he got there, nothing. No one. His voice broke. I'm scared, Reed. Tell me everything, Maya. Anything you remember, anything at all, no matter how small. Her gaze finally met mine, wide and filled with a desperate urgency. There was something I saw before it happened. A few weeks before Thorne's death. Late. I was still working on a report, trying to meet a deadline. Past midnight. I saw him. A man. Not Thorne. Someone else. He was accessing the lab. My breath hitched. Accessing the lab? How? He had a keycard. A different kind. I only caught a glimpse, but it wasn't the standard Omnicorp issue. It was black. No logo. He moved like he owned the place. Confident. He didn't see me, I don't think. I was in the administrative annex, the lights off. He just went in. And then he was gone. I didn't think anything of it at the time. Thought maybe Thorne had a new assistant, a consultant working odd hours. But I never saw him again. And Thorne never mentioned anyone. A black keycard. An unknown individual. This wasn't a random opportunist. Someone who knew the lab's intricacies. Someone who was likely behind the polymer, and behind Thorne's death. And now, behind the escalating threats. My gut tightened. The game had just gotten far more dangerous. The hum of the server racks was a constant, low thrum against the silence of the digital forensics lab. Hours blurred into a single, extended vigil. My eyes, gritty from staring at lines of code and fluctuating graphs, scanned the data streams from Thorne's lab. The air, thick with the smell of old coffee and ozone, felt heavy. Now, I needed to expose the mechanics of the lie. Initial scans had flagged nothing overtly malicious, just a catastrophic system failure leading to the fatal event. But I wasn't looking for a single catastrophic event. I was looking for a narrative, a sequence. I isolated the 5-minute window preceding Thorne's collapse. The system reported a rapid increase in ambient temperature, followed by a sudden shift in the inert gas mixture, then an equipment malfunction. Too neat. Too perfectly aligned. I rewound the logs, focusing on the subtle fluctuations, the nearly imperceptible deviations from baseline. That's when I saw it. The temperature, for instance, didn't just jump. It crept up, a degree at a time, over the course of an hour before the final rapid ascent. Each increment was just below the threshold that would trigger an immediate alarm. Then, the gas mixture. The system indicated a complete failure of the nitrogen regulator. But the log showed a controlled bleed, a slow introduction of a different atmospheric component, minute by minute, disguised as normal system operations. The oxygen levels dipped, not abruptly, but in a carefully orchestrated decline, perfectly coinciding with the temperature rise. My mind replayed the scene in Thorne's lab, the specific burn patterns on his clothes, the localized scorching on the workbench, the way his body had fallen. It wasn't an explosion. It was an asphyxiation event, exacerbated by a sudden, intense thermal reaction. The controlled bleed of an inert gas, likely argon or a similar compound, would have displaced the oxygen. The gradual temperature increase would have primed the environment. Then, a sudden, precise surge of energy, perhaps a focused electromagnetic pulse, directed at Thorne's experimental apparatus. That pulse, in an oxygen-depleted, preheated environment, would have caused a localized, rapid combustion and internal implosion of his volatile reagents, not an external explosion. It would have appeared as a catastrophic malfunction of his research, exactly as intended. The perpetrator hadn't just sabotaged the lab, they had orchestrated a fatal event, designing a slow-burn trap that culminated in a flash of engineered chaos. It was a multi-stage manipulation, triggered remotely. I chased the network logs, tracing the external access points. The lab's bespoke security system, designed by Thorne himself, was notoriously robust. Yet, there it was, a brief, encrypted handshake, originating from an IP address that bounced through 3 different satellite servers before vanishing into the dark web. It was a ghost, but a ghost with a signature. A remote command, executed with surgical precision, bypassing layers of authentication, confirming the black keycard was just one piece of a larger, more sophisticated access matrix. This wasn't a random act. This was an intimate act. Someone knew Thorne's specific protocols, his experimental setup, the precise vulnerabilities of his groundbreaking work. They understood the delicate balance of his reagents, the critical temperature thresholds, the exact atmospheric conditions required for his research to either flourish or catastrophically fail. And why such an elaborate method? I needed another angle. The complexity of the attack, the meticulous planning, suggested a mind capable of deep, sustained malice, perhaps even a history of it. I shifted my focus to Thorne's past associations. Academic rivals, former colleagues, anyone who might have had access to his earliest research, to the very blueprints of his mind. The university's archives were digitized, but incomplete. The paper trail, frustratingly, led to a dead-end entry, referencing institutional relocation of sensitive records. That phrase gnawed at me. Sensitive records often meant problematic records. And institutional relocation in old documents often meant a less than transparent transfer to some forgotten repository. A few calls later, tracing decommissioned facilities and archived storage manifests, I found it, the psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records. It was a relic, a sprawling brick edifice on the city's forgotten outskirts, a place where the past was literally gathering dust. The gate was rusted open, groaning on its hinges as I pushed it inward. The access road was cracked, overgrown with weeds that clawed at the underside of my vehicle. The main building loomed, windows like vacant eye sockets staring out from a crumbling facade. I found the wing specified in the archives, a separate structure connected by a covered walkway, its entrance boarded up with planks that were brittle with age. The records room was exactly as described, rows upon rows of steel shelving, overloaded with cardboard boxes, their labels faded into illegibility. Dust motes danced in the anemic light from my torch. I began my search, box by dusty box, the names and dates blurring into a forgotten tapestry of lives. My fingers brushed over brittle paper, the faint scent of old ink filling my nostrils. Then, a box, tucked away on a high shelf, marked with a faded departmental stamp, Thorne, A. Project Chimera. My breath hitched. This was it. The hum of the server racks, a constant, low thrum, had been my only companion for hours. My eyes, gritty and strained, scanned the data streams from Thorne's lab, searching for anomalies, for anything that didn't fit the narrative of a tragic accident. The initial digital forensics had been exhaustive, yet they felt incomplete, like a meticulously cleaned crime scene where one tiny, damning fiber remained. I'd hit a wall. Every accessible log, every file, pointed to a system overload, a critical failure during a high-stakes experiment. But the burn patterns, the microscopic traces I'd found earlier, screamed otherwise. They suggested a deliberate, almost artistic, destruction. Someone hadn't just wanted the research, they'd wanted to eradicate its very existence, or at least control its narrative. That level of meticulousness, that specific choice of method, implied a motive far deeper than simple acquisition. It suggested a prevention. Someone didn't want Thorne's work stolen, they wanted it stopped. I leaned back, rubbing my temples. Most were mundane reminders, but one line, repeated several times with varying dates, caught my attention: the quiet place. For when the truth needs its own tomb. It was followed by a cryptic string of alphanumeric characters, seemingly random, yet too consistent to ignore. It wasn't an IP address, nor a standard file path. It looked like a fragmented coordinate, interwoven with what could be a date or a code. Thorne was a man of logic, but also a man with a profound sense of self-preservation, evidenced by his lab's elaborate security. He wouldn't leave critical information exposed, nor would he trust it solely to digital storage, knowing the risks of corporate hacking. He would have a dead drop, a physical safe harbor for his most dangerous truths. I cross-referenced the alphanumeric string with obscure public records, historical land registries, and even satellite imagery. It took another 4 hours, but a faint match surfaced, pointing to a sprawling, dilapidated complex on the city's outskirts. It was listed as a former state-run facility, long decommissioned. Specifically, a section labeled Psychiatric Hospital Abandoned Wing with Old Records. The name itself carried a chill, a sense of neglect and forgotten stories. It was exactly the kind of place Thorne, a man who valued anonymity and discretion, might choose. The air was still, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. A broken chain-link fence, rusted and twisted, offered an easy entry point. Weeds choked the cracked pavement leading to the main entrance, a cavernous maw framed by shattered windows. I pushed through a warped wooden door, its hinges screaming in protest. The floorboards groaned under my weight, each step echoing through the vast, empty corridors. The Psychiatric Hospital Abandoned Wing with Old Records was a labyrinth of forgotten lives. Peeling paint hung like tattered banners from the walls. I navigated by the faint light from my tactical flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom, illuminating rows of steel filing cabinets, some overturned, their contents scattered. Stacks of yellowed folders lay in heaps, brittle with age. The air was thick with the smell of mildewed paper and stale air. My mission was specific: find anything connected to Thorne, or to the cryptic alphanumeric code. I started systematically, pulling open drawers, sifting through files, my gloved fingers disturbing decades of accumulated dust. Each folder contained fragments of lives, intake forms, progress reports, discharge papers, all meticulously documented, then utterly forgotten. The sheer volume was daunting. An hour bled into 2. My resolve began to fray. This was a needle in a haystack, a desperate gamble based on a hunch. Just as I considered retreating, my flashlight beam caught a small, wooden box tucked behind a collapsed shelf, half hidden by a cascade of water-damaged files. It was an old cigar box, unassuming, yet out of place amidst the institutional clutter. I pried it open. Inside, nestled among a few dried leaves and a tarnished silver locket, was a small, encrypted USB drive and a folded piece of paper. The paper held a single, handwritten word: Omnicorp. My breath hitched. Omnicorp, the colossal entity that had funded a significant portion of Thorne's research. My hunch was hardening into something concrete, something dangerous. I pocketed the items, the weight of them suddenly immense. This wasn't just about stolen research, it was about something far larger. I inserted the USB drive into a secured terminal. The drive itself was a dead end without the key. But the handwritten Omnicorp note, combined with Thorne's repeated quiet place phrase and the cryptic alphanumeric string, provided the missing piece. It wasn't a standard password. It was a cipher, a layered key Thorne had crafted using personal details and corporate fears. I worked methodically, inputting the transformed string, using Omnicorp as a seed for a cryptographic algorithm I'd seen Thorne dabble with in his accessible notes. The screen flickered. A progress bar appeared, inching forward. My internal thoughts raced. This was it. This was the moment the true motive would reveal itself. The decryption completed with a soft chime. A new, hidden section of Thorne's research logs appeared. My eyes devoured the text, each line a hammer blow. Thorne hadn't just been working on groundbreaking biological advancements, he'd stumbled upon a method for rapid, targeted gene manipulation that could be weaponized with terrifying ease. His logs detailed his growing ethical concerns, his profound distress. He called his discovery Pandora's blueprint and wrote extensively about his fear of its misuse. Then came the real revelation. Thorne hadn't just feared weaponization in general. He'd discovered that Omnicorp was secretly funding a parallel, clandestine project, using his early, unrefined data to develop a biological agent. He suspected they intended to control its distribution, perhaps even its deployment, under the guise of a pharmaceutical breakthrough. His final entries were stark: they are not just funding, they are cultivating. I cannot allow this to be released. I will expose their plan. The world needs to know what Omnicorp is truly building. The complexity of the murder method, the complete eradication of certain experimental data, the precise timing, it all coalesced. They needed to ensure Thorne's Pandora's blueprint remained under their control, and his ethical objections buried with him. I had uncovered the hidden motive, and it was far more insidious, and far more perilous, than I could have imagined. The stale air in the psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records tasted of dust and forgotten lives. Yellowed file folders, their labels faded into illegibility, lined towering shelves that reached for the cracked ceiling. But my attention wasn't on the physical remnants of the past. It was fixed on the luminous display of my secure terminal, a beacon of stark digital clarity in the gloom. The hum of the machine was the only sound, a counterpoint to the distant moan of the wind rattling a loose pane somewhere down the corridor. I'd brought the core data here for a reason. The isolation, the lack of network traces, the sheer oppressive quiet, it was conducive to the kind of deep dive I needed. Omnicorp's digital infrastructure was a labyrinth, but I'd extracted enough to begin mapping its internal landscape. Now, I was cross-referencing everything: the lab's security access logs, the comprehensive employee profiles stored on a sequestered server, and a detailed breakdown of the specialized technical expertise required to execute the kind of precision sabotage that had killed Aris Thorne. My fingers flew across the keyboard, a rhythmic tapping that echoed in the vast, empty space. Lines of code scrolled, databases queried, filters applied. The sheer volume of data was immense, but I was looking for anomalies, for intersections, for the digital fingerprints of someone who didn't just understand Thorne's work but could manipulate it. The murder hadn't been a crude act of violence, it was an engineering feat, a perverse testament to a twisted brilliance. I started with the access logs for the period leading up to Thorne's death. The system registered only a handful of individuals with Level 4 clearance, the level required to bypass certain failsafes and access the core experimental chamber. Each name was a potential suspect, but the list was still too broad. I overlaid that with employee profiles, specifically searching for individuals with advanced degrees in bioengineering, nanorobotics, or complex system architecture, the precise skill sets needed to subvert Thorne's research protocols and orchestrate the catastrophic chain reaction. The screen flickered, filtering the initial pool. The list shrank, revealing a tight cluster of 7 individuals. 7 people who possessed both the access and the expertise. The tension in my shoulders tightened. This was where the real work began. I pulled up each profile, scrolling through employment histories, project assignments, even personal background checks that Omnicorp had meticulously compiled. Most were dedicated scientists, their careers a clear trajectory of academic and corporate achievement. But one name snagged my attention, a name I'd seen peripherally in the initial lab reports, David Thorne. No relation to Aris, the records insisted. His profile was different. Beneath the standard corporate veneer, an unusual entry stood out: previous association with specialized government projects, classified. My brow furrowed. Omnicorp rarely hired outside its well-established academic pipelines for such sensitive roles, especially not for a direct liaison position on a project as groundbreaking as Aris Thorne's. A liaison, a facilitator, a point of contact between the visionary and the corporate machine. Why would such a role require a background in specialized government projects? I dug deeper, using a back-channel access code I'd liberated from a peripheral server. The classified tag wasn't a brick wall, just a thicker layer of obfuscation. My fingers danced, bypassing encryption layers, tunneling through secure servers. The silence of the abandoned wing pressed in, broken only by the rapid clicks. Then, the information began to unfold. David Thorne wasn't just a corporate liaison. His earlier career involved a significant stint in covert operations, a unit specializing in industrial espionage and intellectual property acquisition. This wasn't just about technical skill, it was about strategic infiltration. A quick cross-reference with a publicly available, though heavily scrubbed, database of past corporate scandals yielded another hit. A case from a decade prior, a smaller biotech firm's revolutionary gene editing technology mysteriously stolen, leading to its bankruptcy. The intellectual property later resurfaced under a shell company with loose ties to a larger conglomerate, which, through a series of mergers and acquisitions, eventually became part of Omnicorp. And the lead investigator for the government unit tasked with recovering the stolen IP? David Thorne. The irony was a bitter taste in my mouth. He was positioned as the hunter, but his file contained subtle inconsistencies, a lack of resolution in that old case. He hadn't just investigated the theft, he seemed to have intimately understood its mechanisms. This wasn't just about securing Thorne's research, it was about ensuring its complete and utter control, eliminating any risk of exposure. David Thorne's presence, his background, his specific role, it suddenly felt less like a coincidence and more like a carefully placed piece on a chessboard. He had the access, the technical understanding, and, crucially, a proven track record in the murky world of intellectual property acquisition through less than legal means. The complexity of the murder method, the complete eradication of certain experimental data, the precise timing, it all coalesced. They needed to ensure Thorne's Pando remained their secret. And the man best suited to orchestrate such a sophisticated act, to blend into the corporate structure while possessing the skills of a ghost, was now staring back at me from the screen. The inside man. My focus had narrowed to a single, dangerously intelligent individual. And the game had just become infinitely more personal. The stale air in the abandoned wing of the old records facility tasted of dust and forgotten lives. My attention wasn't on the physical remnants of the past. It was on the present, and the future I was meticulously orchestrating. I moved with deliberate slowness, a phantom in the gloom, adjusting the angle of a propped-open file cabinet. Inside, nestled among genuine decades-old personnel records, lay a fabricated report. It detailed a theoretical breakthrough in polymer stabilization, a precise molecular configuration that Aris Thorne had been pursuing, but, to my knowledge, had not yet achieved. This specific variant was rumored to be the linchpin for a new generation of targeted delivery systems Omnicorp was very interested in. Too interested, perhaps. I knew David Thorne had a habit of checking in on my progress, albeit subtly. He'd shown up at the crime scene, offering assistance, then later at the Forensic Analysis Center, inquiring about timelines. Each time, his eyes had scanned my workspace, not for details of the investigation, but for any hint of what I might have uncovered about Aris's true work. He was looking for the ghost in the machine, the secret Aris had died protecting. My phone, set to record, was tucked into a high shelf, its lens pointed directly at the file cabinet. I pulled out my own worn notebook, scribbling a few innocuous notes, then made a show of answering a call. My voice, carefully modulated, carried just enough to be overheard by any listening ears, or, more likely, any hidden cameras I hadn't yet found. "Yes, I understand," I murmured into the receiver, pacing a short circuit. "A stabilized variant. Remarkable. The yield is higher than anticipated, even for Aris's theoretical models. This changes everything for the delivery mechanism. We're talking about a complete paradigm shift, even beyond the initial projections. Yes, I'm heading back to the lab to verify the trace composition. It's unique. I paused, letting the word hang in the air, a baited hook. I'll confirm the full spectrum analysis. It looks like he cracked the M factor after all. The M factor was a fabrication, a technical sounding term I'd concocted. The implication of a stabilized variant of Aris's experimental polymer was the real trigger. David, intimately familiar with his brother's work and the corporate pressures surrounding it, would recognize the significance. He would know that achieving that level of stability, particularly with the unique trace composition I'd hinted at, would mean Aris had either pulled off an impossible feat or, more likely, had been given illicit resources that pointed directly back to Omnicorp's clandestine bioweapon program. I ended the call, tucked my phone away, and then, with a staged sigh, left the breakthrough report slightly askew in the cabinet. I made sure to leave my own notebook open on a nearby table, displaying a fabricated diagram of the M-factor stabilization process, complete with a few hastily drawn, convincing-looking chemical structures. Then I retreated, melting into the deeper shadows of the adjoining corridor, my heart a slow, steady drum against my ribs. The stale air felt thick with anticipation. The waiting was the hardest part. Minutes stretched into an eternity. I listened, straining for any sound beyond the creaks and groans of the old building. A floorboard groaned somewhere above. A distant clang echoed from deeper within the complex. My senses were heightened, every nerve ending taut. Then, a faint click. A door I'd left ajar, leading into the main archive room, shifted. Footsteps, light and cautious, padded across the worn linoleum. David. He moved with a practiced stealth, a man accustomed to operating in the shadows. I watched through a narrow gap in the shelving, my breath held. He went directly to my workstation, his gaze sweeping over my open notebook. His eyes narrowed, focusing on the M-factor diagram. He then moved to the file cabinet, his fingers brushing the edge of the slightly protruding report. He pulled it out, his movements precise, almost surgical. His face, illuminated by the dim light, was a mask of calculated intent. He read the fabricated report, his jaw tightening. He looked around, a flicker of suspicion in his eyes, but saw nothing. Then, with a sudden, decisive motion, he pulled a small, silver device from his pocket. It was a compact data wipe, designed to erase digital storage and, I suspected, destroy certain types of polymer structures through targeted energy pulses. He aimed it at the report, his finger hovering over the activation button. He froze, his head snapping up. The device clattered to the floor. You took the bait, exactly as I knew you would. I picked up the data wipe device. Trying to erase evidence, David? Again? His composure crumbled, replaced by a desperate scramble for an explanation. I don't know what you're talking about. I was just looking for some old records. Aris's early grants. Don't insult my intelligence, I said, my voice low and steady. The M-factor report was a fabrication, David. A lure, but your reaction? That was very real. I walked towards him, stopping just a few feet away. We found it, David. The trace polymer. Not just in Aris's lab, but at the site of your accident with the prototype, and the subsequent malfunction at the testing facility. A unique, synthetic compound, a byproduct of Aris's experimental polymer. The same polymer you're holding in that report you were about to destroy. His face paled, the blood draining from it. He instinctively glanced at the report in his hand, then back at me. That's impossible. It was. Untraceable. Nothing is untraceable, I countered. Especially when you're dealing with a mind like Aris's. He built in failsafes, David. Microscopic markers. And you, in your haste to cover your tracks, carried them with you. Every time you tried to clean up a loose end, you left a signature. I watched him, waiting. The air crackled with the unspoken truth. He slumped against a shelf, the weight of it crushing him. Their bioweapon development. He found out they were using his research, twisting it. They were going to weaponize the delivery system, not for medicine, but for eradication. I remained silent, letting him talk, letting the confession spill out. They tasked me, he continued, his eyes vacant, staring at some unseen horror. A faction within Omnicorp. They promised me everything. funding for my own projects, a position of power. All I had to do was neutralize Aris. Make it look like an accident. A tragic miscalculation in his own lab. He looked up, his gaze meeting mine, a raw, desperate plea in his eyes. He was going to ruin everything, for everyone. They said he was a liability, a rogue element. He threatened to go public, to bring down the whole division. The pieces clicked into place, forming a horrifying mosaic. The corporate secrets, the academic rivalries, the perilous implications of Aris's final project. It wasn't just about a breakthrough, it was about the weaponization of human ingenuity, and the lengths some would go to protect it. David Thorne, the ambitious brother, caught between loyalty and ambition, had chosen the latter, becoming a pawn in a game far deadlier than he'd ever imagined. The chill that settled in my bones wasn't from the night air, but from the horrifying clarity of it all. David Thorne, Aris's brother, stood silhouetted against the lab's emergency lights, his face a mask of desperation. The name had caught in my throat at the end of the previous chapter, a silent accusation. It wasn't supposed to go this way, he rasped, his eyes darting, searching for an escape that wasn't there. Two uniformed officers were already moving in, their steps deliberate. I watched him, the pieces of the puzzle, the corporate secrets, the academic rivalries, the perilous implications of Aris's final project, coalescing into a grotesque picture. It wasn't just about a scientific breakthrough, it was about the weaponization of human ingenuity, and the lengths some would go to protect it. "Tell me everything," I said, my voice low, cutting through the sterile hum of the lab. "Tell me about Omnicorp. Tell me about the others." He sagged, the fight draining from him as the officers secured him. He didn't fight, didn't resist. The confession, when it came, was a torrent of bitter resentment and calculated fear. He spoke of directives from above, of Aris's stubborn refusal to commercialize the research for military applications, of a containment protocol that had escalated beyond anyone's initial intent. He spoke of a shadowy internal security division, of financial leverage, of a network of influence that reached far beyond the lab's reinforced walls. The following days were a blur of coordinated raids and digital forensics. The lead detective, a stoic woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, oversaw the tactical operations. Omnicorp's gleaming corporate towers, once symbols of innovation, became targets. The arrests began swiftly, high-profile executives and obscure department heads alike, their faces flashing across every news channel. The public shock was palpable. Headlines screamed about corporate espionage, scientific ethics breached, and a potential global catastrophe narrowly averted. I found myself in the eye of a media firestorm, not as a public figure, but as the quiet investigator whose meticulousness had ripped open a carefully constructed facade. Reporters camped outside the precinct, desperate for a quote, a soundbite, anything to explain the unthinkable. I gave them none. My job was to uncover the truth, not to sensationalize it. The ethical debate ignited like wildfire. Was humanity ready for such power? Could it ever be truly controlled? Aris hadn't wanted this. He had fought against it, and it had cost him everything. The fate of Aris's research, the very heart of the conspiracy, became a global chess match. Governments and international organizations, alerted to the true scope of its potential, began vying for control. Diplomatic cables flew, emergency sessions convened. The technology, once a secret, was now a dangerous prize, too potent to be ignored, too volatile to be left unchecked. My part in the immediate aftermath was winding down, but one detail from David Thorne's rambling confession kept gnawing at me. He'd mentioned a failsafe, a hidden repository of encrypted data, not in Omnicorp's systems, but somewhere more obscure, a place connected to Aris's early life, a location he believed no one would ever connect to the cutting edge of bioengineering. He'd only given me a name, a facility that had been closed for decades. It led me to the psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records. The building stood on the outskirts of the city, a skeletal structure against the bruised afternoon sky. Weeds clawed at the crumbling brick facade, and shattered windows stared out like vacant eyes. My footsteps echoed on the cracked linoleum floors as I navigated the labyrinthine corridors. The mandatory location was exactly as described, a long-forgotten archive. Rusting metal shelves lined the walls, laden with yellowed folders and thick ledgers. Each file was a life, reduced to paper and ink. I pulled on a pair of gloves, the quiet crackle of the plastic the only sound besides my own breathing. David Thorne had described a specific set of records, an unusual family connection that Aris had apparently discovered late in his life, something he believed could be used as leverage against the corporation. Not against him, but against them. I found it after an hour of painstaking search, a heavy, leather-bound ledger marked Admissions 1970 to 1975. My fingers traced the faded script until I found the name David had alluded to. A distant relative, institutionalized decades ago, whose brief, troubled existence had intersected with a founding member of Omnicorp in a way that spoke of coercion, of a hidden family shame that had been systematically buried. It wasn't the research itself, but a different kind of leverage, a different kind of secret. Aris had planned to expose the very foundation of their power, not just their current transgressions. This was why David had been tasked with silencing him. It wasn't just about the project, it was about the dynasty. The revelation tightened the knot of tension in my gut. Aris hadn't just been a brilliant scientist, he'd been a meticulous historian, digging into the very roots of the corruption that sought to consume his work. The old records, smelling of mildew and forgotten sorrow, confirmed a deeper, more personal motive for the murder than I had initially grasped. Omnicorp wasn't just protecting a project, they were protecting their entire tainted legacy. And I had just unearthed another piece of it. The dust in the psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records clung to everything, a fine, gray shroud over forgotten lives and discarded truths. It coated the shelves stacked with yellowing files, each one a testament to someone's fractured reality. Sunlight, weak and diffused, struggled through grimy windows, illuminating motes dancing in the stale air. I ran a gloved finger along a warped wooden desk, leaving a clean streak in the accumulated grime. This place, derelict and hushed, felt like an appropriate epilogue to Thorne's story, a final quiet corner to sort through the wreckage. The confession still echoed in my mind, a chilling testament to how easily ambition could curdle into malice. The executive, cornered and broken, had spilled everything, the directives from above, the immense pressure to weaponize Thorne's bioengineering breakthrough. Thorne's refusal, his stubborn adherence to an ethical line, had sealed his fate. He hadn't been a victim of a lab accident, or even a simple act of jealousy. He was a casualty in a war for control over science itself, a conflict fought in hushed boardrooms and high-security labs. I picked up a file from a nearby shelf, its cover brittle, the paper inside crumbling at the edges. It detailed a case from decades past, a man institutionalized for claiming to have invented a perpetual motion machine, his ideas dismissed as delusion. The irony wasn't lost on me. Thorne, too, had held a potentially world-changing secret, but his wasn't dismissed, it was coveted, then silenced. The profound impact of his death wasn't just on his immediate circle, or even the scientific community, it was a wound in the very fabric of ethical progress. It showed how easily the pursuit of knowledge could be corrupted, how the promise of advancement could be twisted into a tool for power and control. The personal toll of these investigations was a weight I carried with me, always. Each case chipped away at a piece of my naivete, replacing it with a harder, more cynical understanding of human nature. I'd seen the fear in the executive's eyes, the calculated ruthlessness that had led him to sacrifice a brilliant mind for corporate gain. But amidst the disillusionment, there was a quiet resolve. This work, sifting through the detritus of tragedy, was necessary. Someone had to bear witness, to ensure that the truth, no matter how ugly, saw the light. Thorne had stood his ground, and though it cost him everything, his integrity remained intact. My job was to ensure his sacrifice wasn't in vain, that the machinations behind his death were exposed for what they were. The system wasn't perfect, but it could be nudged towards justice, one painstaking investigation at a time. With the executive secured and the corporate conspiracy unraveled, Thorne's case finally had its closure. The world would never know the full scope of what he might have achieved, but at least the circumstances of his demise were no longer shrouded in deceit. His research, now under lock and key, would likely remain dormant, perhaps for the best. The implications of his work were too vast, too volatile, to be wielded by those who saw only profit or power. I walked further into the abandoned wing, the floorboards groaning beneath my boots. The question lingered, a persistent hum in my thoughts: how far would humanity go in its relentless pursuit of progress? And at what point did that progress become peril? Thorne had drawn his line, but countless others wouldn't. The struggle between scientific advancement and ethical responsibility was an ongoing battle, one that would undoubtedly lead me to another lab, another body, another hidden truth. I pulled it out. A new message. A brief, cryptic detail about an incident at a remote research facility, a contained breach with unexplained anomalies. The details were sparse. But the familiar prickle of tension began to spread through me. It was never truly over. The dust settled on one case, only for the winds of another to stir.